Hi, Cynthia. You are the director of Delectabule, and you are a Paris based, award winning champagne expert. So, if there was ever going to be anyone who could teach me about buying and drinking champagne, it is you. Can you tell me a little bit about your journey?
Well, I've been living in Paris for 32 years. And when I was 50, in fact, a couple of days before my birthday, I was informed that my job was going to be cut in three. And I decided to hang up my international civil servant hat and do something that really made me happy. And I thought I knew a lot about wine, but I decided it would be better to get a piece of paper to prove it. So I went to wine school. And it was at wine school that I discovered two things. One, the more you learn about wine, the more you realize there is to learn. So at some stage at the end of my studies, I decided to specialize in sparkling wines more as an intellectual challenge. And the other thing that I realized was just how male dominated the wine industry is. And I decided to specialize in mostly champagnes made by women. And since I practice what I preach, cheers to you.
I haven't got any props today. I'm going to have to, after this, I'll know exactly what I need to go out to buy. So, you'd say what proportion of women purchase champagne over men, for instance?
The latest statistics are that 70% of champagne is purchased by women. Well, what I've discovered since I created Delectable is that men and women don't have the same purchasing behavior. Men tend to buy the prestigious bottles, vintage bottles that have the year on them and that you can collect, which represents a teeny tiny percentage of the champagne that's made. And women that come to me are interested in figuring out what style of champagne they prefer and why, and how to get the best bang for their buck. And so
So,
I give them the tools, the confidence to figure it out what they like.
So you mentioned vintage champagne. That is different than a normal champagne. Should that be reserved exclusively for celebration? What exactly do you mean by a vintage champagne?
Um, I guess about 85% of the champagnes on the market are a blend of different years to produce a consistent taste because every harvest is different depending on the weather. And so to get a consistent taste, like for example, Veuve Clicquot's Yellow Label, they blend several years together. A vintage champagne is when you only use grapes from one single year. So a vintage is going to be very different. Let's say 2012 vintage could have been a hot year or a cold year. 2002 could have been a hot year or a cold year, and that will make the champagne taste very different. So when you buy a vintage champagne where the year's written on the bottle, as a consumer, unless you're a champagne geek, you don't know what you're actually getting. All the other bottles, which are a blend of years, um, you don't need to be a champagne geek and know if it's going to be hot, cold year. It will pretty much always taste the same because they blend several years together.
Okay. And that impacts the price significantly, I imagine.
It does because a vintage bottle needs to spend minimum 3 years aging in the cellars of the champagne house, whereas a multi-vintage bottle needs to spend a minimum of 15 months aging in the cellar. So some champagne houses double or triple that amount, but the amount of time it spends in the cellar affects the price tag.
Okay, so once you buy a bottle of champagne, it's not like a red wine that's going to age. How long should you keep it before you drink it?
Um, Well, you can keep vintage bottles longer because when they decide to make a vintage, which they don't do every year, they're looking for grapes that have a higher amount of acidity in them because that helps the bottle age longer. But the rule of thumb is the champagne sellers do all the aging for you. And the rule of thumb is that when you can keep it, the number of years that it's spent aging in the cellars. So if it's a vintage bottle that spent 10 years aging in the cellars, like Comte de Champagne from Tétinger, you can keep it 10 years after they put it up for sale.
Okay, so
the tricky part is that a cork is porous. Okay, so that means oxygen can get in and your bubbles can get out. So when you buy a bottle of champagne, it's not going to benefit from aging. You should drink it. It's ready. It's good to go when the champagne house releases it.
Okay, and what else aside from the year do I have to look at?
To me, it's a couple of things. One, what's the occasion? If it's to have with food, which is most often the case in France, you want to figure out what kind of food you're eating. Some champagnes go better with fish and seafood, and other champagnes go better with meat and poultry. So, for example, a Blanc de Blanc, which is 100% Chardonnay, goes much better with fish and seafood. You would want that with oysters, with caviar, but you would not want a Blanc de Noir, which is made with only red grapes, with your oysters. So you need to figure out what kind of food you'll be serving, to figure out what style of champagne, and who you're drinking with. Is it someone who likes light and fruity champagne? Is it someone who's likes yeasty, intense, complex champagnes? Is it just to celebrate and have fizz, or is it to have with food?
Okay. Well, you mentioned the red grapes. How on earth could they produce champagne from red grapes?
So in France, they call them black grapes for some reason. I don't know why. But if you take a white grape like Chardonnay and a black grape from like Pinot Noir or Meunier, and you cut them in half, you'll see that the inside is white, the pulp. And if you press those grapes really gently, they both produce white juice. And so that's how, more than 90% of the champagnes on the market are white, but made from white grapes and red grapes. And it's by pressing gently, 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 so that there's no contact with the skins, so that the red color of the grapes doesn't bleed into the water, into the juice to make it pink.
Okay, and if it does get to that stage, then they call it a rosé?
There's actually two ways of making rosé champagne. Up until Madame Clicquot, you would use red grapes and you would let the white juice macerate in contact with the red skins, and the red color would bleed into the juice and make it pink. But it's tricky. If you fall asleep on the job, you end up with red wine. And so Veuve Clicquot was, there's got to be a better way and to be more consistent in my rosé production. So she came up with the idea of making white wines from white grapes and red grapes, and then in parallel making red wine. And then at the blending phase, blending her white wines with the red wine to make it pink. Okay, and that's called the blended method.
So, what can you tell me a little bit about the differences between, because you'll see on a label it says brut, demi brut, sec. What does all that mean?
So, the short answer, it refers to the dryness or sweetness of the champagne. Okay, up until Madame Pommery in the 19th century, sugar, there was most of the champagne had more sugar in the bottle than actual wine. They would add like about 200 grams of sugar at the end to make it sweet. But she wanted to please the English market and launched the first dry champagne. And people weren't used to that. She wanted to please the English market, who were used to drinking cider and ale and had a drier palate. But the first people who drank her champagne were like, ooh, that's brutal. And that's where the word brut comes from.
Oh, really?
And yeah. And when the champagne, the cellar master or the winemaker has decided, okay, my bottle is spent 15 months, 3 years, 10 years in the cellar, it's good to go. You need to get rid of the dead yeast in the bottle. Otherwise, you'd end up with cloudy champagne. And so the next step is to disgorge the bottle, which is to remove the dead yeast from the bottle. And you go through what's called the riddling process. You have a bottle that is horizontal, and then you turn it left, right, up, left, right, up, left, right, up. If it's done manually, it takes about 6 weeks. If it's done on a gyro palette, which is like a robot that does it, it takes about 6 days. And you end up with vertical bottle in a vertical position and all the dead yeast in the neck of the bottle. Then you plunge the neck in a solution of minus 25 glycol that produces what I call a yeast popsicle. You turn your bottle up. There's a temporary, it's called a crown cap. It looks like a beer cap. You remove that, and the pressure that's built up in the bottle pushes your yeast popsicle out. You lose some pressure and some wine, and you need to top it up. And that's when the winemaker decides how dry or sweet they want their champagne to be. So if it says zéro dosage or brut nature, that means they just topped up with wine and no sugar. If they add between 0 and 6 grams, it means it's an extra brut. And brut is between 6 and 12 grams of sugar per liter. So those are the 3 dry champagnes, progressively sweeter. And whoever came up with the terminology was messed up. But when you see extra dry, on a bottle, it actually means sweet.
So what we'd say, it says in French, sec, extra sec. Is that right?
And demi-sec.
Got it. So that's sweet, not dry. So can you find some champagnes that are reasonably priced that you could sort of justify, but they're still really good quality? Because there is an urban legend that some award-winning champagne is available in a supermarket, and everybody ripped it off the shelves as soon as it became announced. But can you get a good, very decent bottle of champagne for cheap?
I'm spoiled here in France. I've got champagne in my backyard, and I'm spoiled for choice. The bottle I'm drinking right now is called Secret de Cave, and it's from a small female producer. And I think it costs, when you order it directly from her, 25 or 26 euros a bottle. And it's won medals with Decanter and all kinds of French wine competitions. And that's her part of her fancy range of more expensive blends. In France, you can get really good quality champagne. Look for the symbol of the medals when you're out shopping. Ask your wine shop owner if they have recommendations. There's a website, Sparkling Wines from Around the World, I think it's called, that every year has a competition and ranks all of the sparkling wines and the medals. You can look them up. If you have a trusted wine magazine, look them up. And price really does not guarantee quality. For example, we were talking about Rosé Champagne earlier. There's this French wine magazine that did a sort of blind tasting of about 30 different rosé champagnes. and 3 of them came out on top with 18 out of 20, because everything's graded in France out of 20. And one that came out that got 18 out of 20 was Don Ruinart Rosé, which is a vintage champagne, and it costs about 300 euros per bottle. The second one that came out that got 18 out of 20 was from a small female producer and only cost 30 euros a bottle. And all of these were blind tasted. So it helps when you do a little bit of homework and look at, read wine magazines, look at reference websites, follow me on Instagram. I usually provide lots of tips of that nature.
So in terms of mixing your champagne in a cocktail, is that super taboo, or is that something you would condone? Oh dear, you're making a face.
Yeah. Well, I'm old school, and there's so much time and effort that goes into making a bottle of champagne, and the aromas and flavors are very discreet. And for example, if you add a really expensive bottle of Dom Pérignon into your cocktail is not going to taste better because you used an expensive champagne in it. Okay. In fact, you'll waste all the nuances by adding anything into it. And a lot of champagne houses have realized that with the whole, especially during COVID, the cocktail trend, that a lot of people were using champagne in their cocktails. And so some of them have designed specific champagnes for cocktails. Basically, they're quick and dirty versions of champagne. They'll age the minimum requirement, but they'll often be a lot sweeter as well. I know Moët & Chandon, I think it's called Ice. Pommery created one, Veuve Clicquot as well. And it's so that they can sort of ride the cocktail trend train. But to be honest, I find that other sparkling wines are better for mimosa, for example. I would use Prosecco instead of champagne because Prosecco is very fruity, whereas champagne is very brioche yeasty. And so the fruity side of Prosecco complements the juice or any sweet thing that you put in the cocktail.
Okay, and so what exactly is the difference between Prosecco, Cava, and champagne? Aside from, we all know that champagne is region designated, but very quickly, how do you tell the difference between a Prosecco and a Cava and a champagne?
Okay,
it's
well,
the
there's
process,
the region.
But is it in the, when you're tasting it, can you tell the difference in the process, or?
With a Cava, I mean, there's two schools of Cava, old school Cava and new school Cava. The new school Cava are using similar grape varieties to Champagne, so Chardonnay, Pinot Noir. And old school are using local grape varieties. And so there's a little bit of a debate going on within the region as to what philosophy you should adopt. But generally speaking, a Cava that's made with Chardonnay and Pinot Noir isn't going to be as acidic and crisp as a Champagne because it's a lot warmer in Spain than in the Champagne region. So they use the exact same method, sometimes the same grape varieties, but their climate is different, and that has an impact on the final taste. Prosecco is a whole different can of worms. It's a different country, different grape variety, Glera, which is very fruity. When you smell Prosecco beside a glass of champagne, the Prosecco almost smells like pears. It's really super fruity. And the color is almost like white, like water, compared to, for example, what I'm drinking right now, where you can really see the yellow gold color. And Prosecco, the grapes are harvested by machine. They're not harvested manually like in Champagne. And the second fermentation takes place in a huge pressurized tank. And the wine doesn't spend very much time in contact with the yeast. So that's why it's super fruity. Whereas Champagne, as I explained, the second fermentation takes place in a bottle. and has to spend a minimum of 15 months aging in contact with the yeast, versus Prosecco that spends sometimes 10 days in a huge tank in contact with the yeast. So it affects the aromas and flavors, and of course the price tag. That's why Prosecco is so much cheaper than Champagne, because they don't need the in Champagne, they bring in 120,000 people every harvest season to hand pick the grapes. In Prosecco, most of them are harvested with machines that shake the grapes off. So there's no quality control. You pick the bunches that have disease, that aren't ripe, and so on. So there's a lot of factors. I could go on for hours about the differences, but basically that's it.
Okay, I see. What about the glass? I see you're drinking, obviously not out of the coupe, or the one that was modeled after Marie Antoinette's breast. What do you recommend in terms of glasses to drink out of?
Yeah, I just want to burst that bubble about Marie Antoinette's breasts. No boobs were involved in the design of the coupe. Yeah, so that is an herb that's legendary and unfounded. The coupes came a lot later in the 1920s. During Marie Antoinette's time, they were like cone-shaped glasses. So her boobs were not involved in the shape of the coupe. There's a physicist at the University of Reims who studies the science of bubbles. And he measures the size, the shape, the behavior. He has a high-speed camera that looks at the different ways of opening a bottle, the different ways of pouring your champagne, and the impact of the shape of your glass. So there's lots of things that impact the behavior of bubbles, and the shape is an important one. And the bubbles, when they hit the surface and burst, they release their aromas. Okay, so if you have a coupe that has a large surface like this, not only do you not really get to admire your little tornado bubbles in your glass, but you lose all of your bubbles and the aromas because the surface is so large. Okay? In the regular flutes that everyone's used to, you have the opposite problem. You get to admire your little tornado bubbles in your glass, but all the CO2 that's released when the bubbles burst is trapped at the top of your glass, and the opening is really narrow. And I'm sure it's happened to you before. Someone has served you a glass of bubbly in a flute, and you go to drink it, and you get CO2 up your nose. And there's actually a technical term for that. It's called effervescence burn. And so in Champagne, everyone drinks out of this shaped glass, which is called the tulip shape. What's important is the V shape here, right down here. Mm-hmm. Some glass makers scratch laser a scratch in the inside to create a more consistent tornado of bubbles. But what's important is the fact that it's wider at the middle. And so you fill your glass to the fattest, widest part. And then when the champagne bubbles hit the surface and burst, they've got all of this room here to actually breathe. And the opening is a lot wider. So you can actually, the wine can actually breathe, and you can actually get your nose in and smell the delicate aromas of the champagne. So the ideal glass is a tulip shape like this.
Got it. And does it matter whether it's glass, crystal, plastic?
So plastic glasses actually kill the bubbles. If you ever try pouring a glass into one of those red plastic cups that you have for picnics, and you'll notice that the bubbles on the side are huge. Okay, they're called frog eyes bubbles, and the plastic kills the bubbles basically.
So you're better off drinking directly from the glass. If you're going to be not very classy and drink out of a plastic cup, you might as well just drink out of the bottle. Is that the better of the two options?
Any type of glass would be better than plastic.
Okay. I think we'll just use the bottles. All right, so we're gonna get a tulip. We're gonna get not plastic. Champagne would be better in a crystal one versus glass, presumably. And you don't put them in the dishwasher. I know that you hand wash, but without soap. Is that right? Or without rinsing agent, anyway.
It's the rinsing agent that is the worst enemy of bubbles. They kill bubbles. Fancy restaurants have special rinse liquid that doesn't affect the bubbles, but average people like us don't have this special rinse liquid. So you're better off just washing the outside of your glass with regular dish soap and the inside with hot water. And then you dry with a linen towel, and that linen towel will leave microfibers that you and I can't see inside the glass, and that helps produce more bubbles.
Got it. Okay, so we're all about the bubbles. I get it. So how then all right, the idea for opening a bottle is somebody said to me once, it has to be no louder than a woman's sigh. So what is the best technique for opening a bottle of champagne?
Thanks to my physicist, Gérard Liger-Belair. Here, I've got a half bottle that I can open. Let's see.
Okay, what are all the parts? Let's name all of that.
So this is a baby bottle, but what I just ripped off is the foil.
Yeah.
Okay. And this next part is called the cage in English.
Okay.
In French, it's called a muselet, which comes from the word muzzle. Okay, because you're muzzling the bottle. That's my necklace here. Is a little baby muzzle.
Baby muzzle.
Okay. So you take your weak hand, you put your thumb on top. Okay, that's your safety mechanism, because as soon as you loosen the cage, the cork can go flying. Okay, so this is to your safety mechanism. You loosen the cage so that it's not stuck under the lip, and then you switch to your strong hand without taking your thumb off. In champagne, they leave the cage on because it gives you a better grip. Okay, you put the cage part between your fingers, you grip the cork, and you hold the bottom of the bottle. And the trick is to hold it at 45-degree angle, because I don't know if you can see, there's a little air bubble there.
Yep.
If you open your bottle vertically, that air bubble puts more pressure and harder to control your cork. But if you hold the bottle at 45-degree angle and you turn the bottle, not the cork, and you twist the bottle while gripping the cork, and then when your cork is almost out, I couldn't show you, but you when you feel it almost coming out, you twist the cork down at an angle, and you hear that sound. So some people call it the champagne kiss. Other people, the champagne sigh. What else have I heard it called? Champagne. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of different expressions. But basically, if you hear a pop, you haven't opened it properly. And if you hear a sound, you've opened it properly. And the goal is to save your bubbles again, because this is releasing that air bubble very gently.
Got it. All right. And then you drink it is it straight out of the fridge? Is that the best temperature?
It depends what you're drinking, okay? And it depends on the temperature of your fridge. But a vintage champagne, so with the year on the bottle, the aromas are more important than the bottles, because it's the bubbles, sorry. It's the aromas that make the difference between one vintage and another. And a vintage you would serve at the same temperature as a white wine, so between 10 and 12 degrees Celsius. A multi-vintage you would serve between 8 and 10. My fridge is at 4 degrees Celsius. So by the time I take the bottle out of the fridge, um, open the bottle, I let it sit for a bit. Then I open the bottle and pour the glasses. Then it's usually close to 8 degrees Celsius.
Got it. Okay. Well, by the time I usually get it home from the shop, I don't have time to put it in the fridge. It just gets opened immediately at whatever temperature. Never do we put ice in it, of course. So what I sorry, are you just going to carry on working with women or and carry on supporting women in the way that you're doing, or have you got other plans for your business?
I mean, that's always sort of been my mission since day one, is to support female producers. It's my niche. And it makes sense when you know that 70% of champagne is purchased by women. And when I talk to women, they tell me if there's two similar champagnes styles, like two Blanc de Blanc, similar prices, one made by a man, one made by a woman, that women would be more than happy to buy the bottle made by a woman to support her. But they don't know. It's not written on the bottle. Like, for example, the Laurent Perrier bottle that I opened. It's run by two sisters, Stephanie and Alexandra. And women have told me that they want to learn the stories about the women behind the bottle. So I have a lot of work to tell the stories. There's so many women involved in the history of champagne. So much so that I'm actually writing a book about the history of the role of women in champagne, because they're behind, women were the first champagne ambassadors. They were behind so many innovations. I mentioned a couple with Veuve Clicquot and Pommery, but there's so many other innovations, and during all the wars that happened in Champagne. And so I plan on sticking with that.
When your book has been published, would you come back and visit us again and talk us through the book?
With pleasure.
Great. And actually, why don't we just do a podcast on site and we can actually sample all the bubbles ourselves, like including me.
You're always welcome here. And I like to say onwards and upwards like a champagne bubble. So if you have any women that are champagne lovers and have a touch of feminism running through their veins, I would be more than happy to introduce them to some champagne made by some bubbly badasses.
Very good. I'm sure we can find some for you. Thank you so much for your time, Cynthia. It was great chatting with you. And I look forward to going out to the shops first thing tomorrow morning and buying a couple of bottles of not sec, brutal champagne.
There's a list on my website homepage. You can add a link in your podcast notes. It's a list of all the champagne producers where women play an important role. So if you want to use that list to guide you, help yourself.
Okay, well, I'll work my way through the list one at a time, and I'll report back. Anyway, thanks again for all your good advice, and we look forward to your book coming out soon.
Cheers to you.
Cheers.